Welcome, everybody, to our next session of Understanding the Bible. I'm John Thalis, my privilege to be the pastor of the Bronson Archer Charge of the United Methodist Church, and this is session number 3 of our Bible study. This is our session for March the 6th, 2019, and just want to give you a chance to review what we covered in class last night. We have been sort of trying to understand how this arc of Bible history fits. This is not necessarily the order of all of the books that are in the Bible. Remember, they're not written in chronological order, but if you take the events that the books of the Bible talk about and place them in a time order, then this is kind of what you get. And we've been using this picture to sort of take us through that time. In class tonight, we tried to put these events onto something of a timeline with world history as we might know it. And let me just tell you, I won't be able to go over everything we discussed, but picture number 1, which is, of course, a symbol of the creation of the world, that begins back sometime before the year 4000 BC or so. 4000 is about when we begin to get parts of history being written down. Those are some of the oldest historical records that we have. The opening pages of the Bible happen before recorded history. When you go all the way back to the beginning, that's maybe kind of easy to understand. But as you move forward, we begin to pick up the timeline around 2,500 years or so before the time of Christ. So around 2,500 BC, we begin to get stories of people in the Bible. As we move on up to section number 2, the stories of the patriarchs, Abraham, we're looking at about 2,000 years or so before the time of history or before the time of Christ. And so the timeline sort of moves from left to right around there. We're going to talk, we did talk in tonight's session about the timeline that moves up till about the time of Jesus, which is all the way over on number 10, come all the way across the top of the arc. And of course, we're going to put the time of Jesus at right around the year 0 or so. Actually, Jesus was probably born on what the calendar would have as somewhere around 4 to 6 years BC. It's not exactly accurate. And that would mean that Jesus died at the age of 33, probably somewhere around the year 29 or 30. AD. Well, that's the time period we're talking about in our session for tonight. Now, just a quick review coming all the way around that timeline. If you divide the Bible into the eras that it speaks about, creation is the first Bible era. Again, that's number 1 on the chart. Adam is the name we remember because that was the name of the first human. We saw that Eve was his wife. God was with them in the garden. The story of the serpent interrupting them in paradise, getting them to eat the tree of the fruit. Moves on to the stories that include Noah and the ark, and of course the Tower of Babel. Those are the events that all happen sort of in this time before written history begins to happen. The second era, as you move up the chart, is we called the era of the patriarchs. Patriarch is a word for father. The father of the Hebrew nation was a man called Abraham. He's sort of the main character to remember. And as Abraham was called by God to take a journey of faith, the rest of the book of Genesis begins to tell that story. You get Abraham, his son Isaac, his son Jacob, and then Jacob's sons. He has 12 of them. They become the 12 sons, the 12 tribes of Israel, because Genesis tells the story of how Jacob's name was changed to Israel and why that was so. And that takes us up to probably around the year 1800 or so BC. And we come then to the Bible's third time era, known as the period of the Exodus. Exodus means coming out. And this was the story of the Israelites after they had moved to the land of Egypt. Actually, God preserved their lives there. After a time, they were put into slavery. They cried to God to be delivered. And so God spoke to a man named Moses, who became known as the deliverer, and brought them out of the land of Egypt. They wandered for about 40 years in the desert. God did not intend for them to wander for 40 years, but just like we all do, they didn't really want to listen and didn't want to do things God's way. And so they ended up wandering for a while. During that time, God gave Moses the Ten Commandments. You will also hear Moses sometimes referred to as the lawgiver. And of course, the Ten Commandments become the very important cornerstone of the Jewish law, and still important to us to this very day. The next time period, and this is where we finished 2 weeks ago, was the Bible timeline known as conquest. This was when the Israelites finally were allowed to come into the land that would become known as Israel. Joshua is the main leader during the time of the conquest. And so these tribes of Israel now move into the land. They have to take some of it by force. They literally have to fight for their lives against some of the natives that are there. And that's why the symbol is these two crossed swords. Eventually, they do take possession of the entire promised land and are living together as sort of a loose confederation of clans and tribes. They're not really a nation at this time. The thing that happens next, and this is where we spend our time beginning in class this past week, is a time period known as the time of the judges. Now, judges weren't exactly what we would think of in this day with a courtroom and a long black robe and listening to cases. They were individual men and women who rose up to lead the tribes of Israel for a time. Sometimes they did judge cases. Sometimes they did sort of enforce the law. The main thing to remember is that the judges usually came at a time of peril or danger, which, as the story is told, was almost always caused by the sin of the people. They would turn away from God, some kind of trouble would come up, some kind of threat, and then God would raise up a judge who would either lead them to a military victory, or sometimes lead them to repent and turn to God, turn to the Lord, or in some other way would help the people to pass the time of stress and the time of trouble. The most famous judge was a man by the name of Samson, and pretty much all of us have heard the story of Samson, and his great strength was symbolized by his long hair. His hair was never cut from the time he was a child until he met a woman by the name of Delilah. And she got to his heart and sold him out, really. And Samson was defeated by his enemies for a time. He prayed and asked God to give him one more opportunity. His hair grew back out. And at the end of his time, Samson kind of brought the house down. Literally, you can read the story in the book of Judges. So we remember Judges, we remember Samson, and these were people who just came up every few years to sort of help the nation of Israel, but they really weren't rulers, not in the sense of our next time period, which brings us to the time of the kingdoms. Eventually, after about another 400 years or so, the people of Israel wanted to be, and the scripture says this, like the other nations. They wanted to be led for a king. They didn't really want to trust God anymore to send judges or other deliverers, and so they asked for a king. Samuel, who was the last of the judges in Israel, followed the direction of God and allowed the people to anoint their first king. His name happened to be Saul. The most famous king of Israel was King David, and the nation reached its greatest power, its greatest height, its greatest triumph under the leadership of David. It is from the family of David that eventually Jesus is going to be born, and so he's a pretty important character in this Old Testament story of the nation of Israel. Eventually, though, after David and his son and then his grandson, there are some tensions in Israel, and the kingdom is divided into a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And after there'd been probably another 10 or 15 or 20 or so different kings, eventually both of those kingdoms are conquered, and the era of the kingdoms comes to an end. Well, that leads to this seventh area, and we're coming all the way across the top of the chart now. This is the era known as exile. Now, don't confuse exile and Exodus. Exodus was earlier, and that's when the children of Israel were coming out of a time of being captured and enslaved. Unfortunately, exile is a time where they were carried in or carried away and were imprisoned. After the years of kings that led the people of Israel away from the will of God, the Lord allowed the conquering armies of Assyria and Babylon to defeat Israel and to carry its citizens away. One of the most famous Bible characters in the time of the exile was Daniel. And you probably have heard the story of Daniel in the lion's den. Well, Daniel was thrown into the lion's den by the foreign king because Daniel refused to worship any god but the God of Israel. And of course, God delivered Daniel. The exile lasted for a time period of 70 years. For 70 years, the Jewish people were carried away and were not able to live in that promised land, the land of Israel. But eventually, God moved in the heart of a foreign king named Darius, and he allowed the Jewish people to return to their homes. And so this next time period, number 8, is the era known as return. When they got back, they found that their land had been devastated. The temple of God was in ruins. So that was rebuilt. They rebuilt the walls of Jerusalem. Two of the main leaders we read about during this time period were Ezra, who was a priest and led the religious rebuilding, and a man by the name of Nehemiah, who was the governor, and he led the social and the political rebuilding of the nation of Israel during the time of the return. This lasted for that time period lasted for about 150 years or so, and then when we reach the time period that begins about 400 years before the time of Christ, so we're up to about 400 BC now. Suddenly, there were no more prophets and there are no more Bible books that were written down. We call this the era of silence. The very last book written was Malachi, again, about 400 years before the time of Jesus. And so, until we reach the time where Jesus is born and a fellow by the name of John the Baptist comes on the scene, there's no other word from God. There's no other activity. The nation is waiting for the redemption of God, and there's a period of silence. Well, that's a pretty quick run through the timeline. Right now, our main objective is just to keep the main ideas together, to put them into sort of a timeline order so that we know what came next. We've got a few more books of the Bible to talk about, but basically, this completes the history portion of the Old Testament. All of those books of history that we've talked about before, beginning in Genesis, moving all the way through Samuel and Chronicles and Kings, moving on in all the way up to the ending of the exile, the return, and all of those books. All of the prophets spoke during those times. We're going to come back and talk about the prophets in another session. But just kind of want to keep in mind the order that everything happens in. Remember, we go back to before 4000 BC, starting in picture number 1. We move our way up to about 2500, 2000, 1800, 1200. The kings happen about 1,000 years before the time of Christ. The exile happens about 600 or so years before the time of Christ. Then there's the return 70 years later, and finally 400 years of silence just before the time of Jesus. We'll be back next week. We're going to be talking about some of the other parts of the Old Testament. We'll be talking about the books of poetry and also the books of the prophets. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.